Okay, welcome everybody to week 3 of the World Vision Mongolia Mini Masters on International Development. This is an actual original recording, not from World Vision Albania, because I have the right computer with me this year. Last time I did this, I had the wrong computer and I had to just write things. So there are two sections that I want to talk about to introduce in this video. The first part of the section relates to outlining the concepts in week 3. Uh, so the just to give a little bit of a background, the first week we looked at the paradigms of development, which define our assumptions about the causes of poverty, and then also because of our assumptions about the causes tells us what we do, what we should do, because this is how we define the cause, right? The cause solution. Week 2 was bringing up the concept of it's not just what you do, but it's how you do it that has impact. So David Corton's framework for the 4 generations of NGOs was this idea of one of the ways of thinking about how you do it. His contention is that the way you do something will have unintended consequences that can either be positive or negative. So you might have, for example, a modernization approach, according to David Corton, uh, and that can tell you to do a certain type of program. But whether you function as an administrator, generation 1, as a trainer, generation 2, as a facilitator, generation 3, or as a networker, generation 4, will have different types of consequences for your action, for the programming you do. So you'll have different unintended consequences. This week, week number 3, I wanted to introduce a concept for thinking about some of those unintended consequences. This framework, this conceptual framework, is social capital. And what social capital says, well, you'll see it in a second here, but what social capital uses is the social networks that we impact by doing our programming. So that's what I'm going to introduce for here in the main part of the video. The second part of the video, I very quickly want to talk about week 4. Although we're ahead of ourselves, I want you to. Week 4 is actually group work, and so I want to give you some warning so you can think about it while you're working on week 3. So, um, social capital. You will see in the handouts I gave to Biamba to pass around to everybody, there is another video link that defines social capital in more detail. But I want to talk a little bit. This lecture right now is quickly talking about the background of why social capital became important. So the story began in the 1980s in the United States. Now, I normally have a picture of the United States up here, but in the 1980s in the United States, there were a number of small rural towns were dying. There was population flow out of the towns. The abandonment, the whole middle part of the United States was basically disappearing in terms of population. And so this led people, and this was around rural communities, so this led people to ask the question, how do we sustain, what does it take to sustain a community? What are the characteristics of a sustainable community? So the first response to that in the 1980s was thinking about, well, a sustainable community will have 3 types of capital, of resources. There'll be natural resources like soil and water, mining, if there's minerals, if there's mining. There's economic capital, which is sort of like the businesses, and then things like the infrastructure, roads, electricity, wireless, those kinds of banking would have been banks would have been another part of that, and then the third capital was human capital, so the knowledge and skills of the people that live in the community. So what they said, or what people were thinking about in the 1980s, was okay, if we look at a small rural town and we do a needs assessment and we say which of these three capitals, the natural resource capital, the economic capital, or the human capital, which of those things needs to be strengthened? And if we design a project that will strengthen that thing, uh, so let's say it's human capital. So we design a project to do training because we've identified that the people in the community, the reason the community is dying is because the people don't know how to, I don't know, farm correctly. So we'll do a training program. Let's say it was an economic capital was the problem. Let's say we decided that the reason why the town is dying is that the infrastructure is not good. We need to build more roads, so forth. Uh, so they said if we design a program or a project that relates to strengthening the capital that's weak, we will maintain these communities. They will become sustainable. So the first contradiction that happened was that there was something going on that people couldn't explain. And I'll state it very briefly here. It was sort of sometimes really poorly designed projects, or really so I'll start with the other way. Sometimes really well developed projects failed miserably, and the town still ended up dying. So we did all the needs assessment correctly. We did all of the we identified which capital it was that was in question, and nevertheless, when we applied it, the town still died. And then those other things that were sort of, I will say, poorly designed, poorly executed, and yet succeeded wildly. And so this got people thinking. It's like there's something going on that we can't see. There's an invisible capital. These three capitals, natural resource, economic, and human, aren't enough. There's something else that's affecting the success and failure of our projects and the success and failure of the town. And so this invisible capital, people were starting to notice it by 1990. And so by 1994, this capital had become defined, and it was, basically it was this idea of social capital. They said there's a structure of social networks that exists in the community, a social context beyond these three capitals here of natural resource, economic, and human. There's a social context. And that social context will actually affect the other capitals. So if you have a really strong social capital, you can overcome weaknesses in these other capitals. And if you have a very weak social capital, then even if these other capitals are strong, the community ends up suffering. So and then the second sort of principle was the way that NGOs work, organizations work, can actually affect the quality of these capitals. Um, uh, so, um, so even though your program might be focused on natural resource management, the way you do it can have an effect on the social capital of the community. And the social capital of the community, in turn, can strengthen or weaken the community in a whole variety of ways. So this led to a lot of very dark humor in the 90s in NGOs about the project was a success, but the community died because they were noticing that the way that the projects were being implemented had an effect on things beyond what the project was intending to target. So I found social capital is a very useful framework for thinking about some of these unintended consequences of the way we work. Um, the second sort of principle here, you'll see all of these in the readings, but I'm just describing them here. Uh, there's this idea of inside social capital, there's two types of social capital. There's bonding social capital and there's bridging social capital. So the other video link that I'm sharing here talks about these a little bit more about strong ties versus weak ties. But basically, bonding social capital are strong internal connections inside a group. But bonding social capital can be exclusive. So you're inside the group or you're outside. There's a strong identity of us versus them. Bridging capital are the connections between groups. So, so if there's lots of bridging capital in a community, it means there's lots of connections between the different groups. If there's little bridging capital, then it means each of the groups in the community tend to be isolated. So, a theorist named Jan Flora, who looks at some of these issues of social capital, identified sort of four types of communities based on these bridging and bonding things. He said, so the worst community is individualism. So he said there's no bridging and there's no bonding. Like there's nothing. It's just everybody's out for themselves. The poor have little options. The wealthy tend to substitute economic capital for social capital. So they buy their security, they buy their own transportation, but the poor suffer. So individualism is the worst type of community where there's no bonding and no bridging. The second worst type of community is clientelism, which means there's no group, there's no strong groups, there's no bonding capital in the community, but there's strong bridging capital, which means that everybody in the community has connections outside of the community, but nobody in the community has connections with each other. And this is a difficult community to work in because everybody is actions are guided by external interests, not by community interest. The so these are both very very difficult communities to work in, especially even if you're an NGO. These two types of communities are really difficult to actually successfully implement projects because individualism and clientelism means that there's little interest in mobilizing for community well-being. Um, a third, the sort of the third type of community is regionalism, and what he means by that is that there's strong groups that exist, but there's little connection between the groups. Regionalism, he says, is very resistant to change. Now, but what I've seen in NGOs, and this is in my other article, is that NGOs can play a really good role in connecting these groups in their programming if they're intentional about it. So NGOs can have a lot of impact in regionalism because the NGO itself can serve as the bridging capital that's missing. And if you add the ingredient of bridging capital to regionalism, you get progressive participation, which is the best type of community. And this is a community that has strong groups, strong group identities, and also has strong connections between the groups. There are lots of connections between the groups. This type of community is the best for engaging in community development. They're the most proactive. They're the most that are willing to organize around things. Their projects that are done in these communities tend to be more successful in general because of this because of having high bridging and high bonding. So one of the things I've found is that if the NGO is strategic in trying to build bridges between groups, they can transform regionalism into progressive participation. but you have to have the groups. Now, if you don't have the groups, if you're over here in the clientelism and individualism communities, those are really hard to work with. Urban communities, especially slums, are often these kinds of where people have migrated in. So, for example, around Ulaanbaatar, there's these slum communities with where people have sort of migrated in. They live in the yurts, in the and there's a lot of wood fire burning. Those communities would often be very difficult to work in as a World Vision, because there's probably very little group identity. People are either connected back to where they had migrated from, so clientelism, or there's just no connections at all. And so these communities are hard to work in. This community is hard to work in, but an NGO can have impact if they work strategically. And these communities, the progressive participation, are the best to work in. So the idea of social capital then generated a whole lot of thinking. This picture isn't very good, but a whole lot of thinking about what other types of capital exist. And currently, in this sort of framework of community capitals, there's 7 different types of capitals that have been identified. So economic capital, political capital, human capital, cultural capital, natural resource capital, etc. The social capital is now considered one of these. So when NGOs work in communities now, a lot of their needs assessment, a lot of their assessments before they go in is around understanding the social capital in the context as well, although they don't always use these terms. So what I found interesting is thinking about how do communities work how do NGOs work that strengthen or hurt community social capital? And my research, or some of my research, was to identify different things that NGOs did that either helped or hurt a community's social capital. And I've clustered some of the findings into 4 general things. The first is participation. Now, I know in all of our stuff we always talk about participation, etc. But there's actually a connection between participation in projects and strengthening community capital. So the more you can include different community groups, the more you can minimize power differences, the more there's rotating leadership between groups, the stronger social capital there is, because you're doing more bridging capital. You're connecting. The other thing that helps is having low resources, which is ironic for World Vision because World Vision manages lots of resources, so they often struggle with this. But the less that you're channeling external resources into a community, the less damage you do to social capital. And the problem is, money is like a form of gravity. It distorts relationships when you get a big pile of money coming into a context. And it's one reason why NGOs and like World Vision have moved to this idea of partnering, because at least you're trying to channel the money through existing structures rather than bringing in your own external structure. So partnering, which is another mini masters topic later, is really around this idea of how do we manage some of these issues of low resources and enhancing participation, continuity, confidence, and trust. All of these things are elements for justifying partnering, and it's really around this framework of how we strengthen the social capital in addition to our other programming. So continuity is another important thing. It matters who the person is you're relating to, not just the organization. And then ways to build trust and confidence. Obviously, these are things. The way you do your programming, if it hurts or helps confidence, will affect your social capital in the community, which will affect other things that happen. So then I have another slide here. I'm not going to talk about it because I've been talking too long here now, but around what types of participation in a project, where are the different places that participation can be done. We usually NGOs usually think about participation only in respect to number three. When you do implementation, you try to get people in there to participate at the last minute. But another theorist, Elizabeth Phelps, in her master's, was talking about you need to do participation across all of these dimensions: needs assessment in the planning and the implementation, and then in the evaluation, and that there's spaces for participation. Um, I'm not going to go into a lot of that right here. You can read more about it in the article. But just thinking about the way we work on things like this can affect things like this, and like community participation, resources, continuity, and these things can affect the community's social capital, which in turn affects the sustainability of the community. So I wanted to introduce this concept. You will read the article and watch the other video link, and but keep these things in mind and write the essay, of course. The second thing I wanted to do today, whoops, I didn't download it yet, is briefly outline. So week four, what week four is you in groups are going to be presenting back to me things from the 3 weeks. And so let me pull up this final presentation. This is in the things I'm sharing as well. But I want you to divide into 4 groups. Now, I was thinking about dividing you, but I'm not sure where all of you are based, and I'm not sure. It would be easier if you were like relatively close to each other. So I will consult with Biamba this week and have her divide you into 4 groups. So each group will have 3 to 4 people. And instead of doing a paper and essay, what I want you to do is actually make a video clip like I'm doing right now with YouTube. Make a video presentation to answer some of the questions. I don't have the questions on here yet, but I will post those later. But what you should actually do the presentation about. And what I want you to do is make a video presentation based on the analysis. What you're going to do a case study of your own context, and I want you to post this clip using all 3 weeks, and post this clip by April 3rd. And then I think these dates are correct. No, shoot, these are not the right dates. I will have to get back to you on the right dates. Um, I thought I had this. This is from Albania. So I will update you on the dates, but it would basically be um, the last week. You should post the clips by the weekend, um, and then the which would be the 11th, and then on the 15th we would have our last meeting to discuss. So this would be March 11, and then this discussion would be March 15. There, that's the right dates. And then this wrap up for week 4 would be week 3 wrap up and preparing for week 4 would be March 8. That the next video or the next Skype conversation. So that these are the right dates here. So March 8, March 11, and then March 15 for turning in. We'll talk more about this, but I wanted to present this now so that you're thinking about your group. And then next week, when I give you the actual case study analysis to do, you would be working together to develop it. All right. I think that's probably long enough for a YouTube mini lecture on, but I wanted to present this concept of social capital so that we, as you think about the article and applying it to your work in World Vision and what you see happening, that this would be an important element. Okay, thank you and good night.